Hello, everyone. Today we're diving into the magical world of Alice in Wonderland, but this time we're focusing on some tricky and unusual words that even advanced English learners might not know. I'll explain each word in a simple way with examples so you can understand and use them easily. Ready to explore Wonderland with me? Let's begin. 1. Alas. Alas means an old word used to express sadness or pity. For example, "Alas," said Alice, "I've grown too tall." Another example, "Alas, the rabbit was gone." 2. Curiouser. Curiouser means even more strange or unusual. For example, "Curiouser and curiouser," cried Alice. Another example, "The dream became curiouser with every minute." 3. Splash. Splash means the sound or act of something hitting liquid. For example, "She fell into the water with a splash." Another example, "The frog made a big splash in the pond." 4. Peep. Peep means to look quickly or secretly. For example, Alice peeped into the rabbit hole. Another example, the child peeped through the keyhole. 5. Whiskers. Whiskers means the long hairs on an animal's face. For example, the rabbit's whiskers were shaking. Another example, the cat cleaned its whiskers after eating. 6. Peculiar. Peculiar means strange or unusual. For example, "What a peculiar place this is." Another example, "He has a peculiar way of laughing." 7. Tumble. Tumble means to fall suddenly and helplessly. For example, "Alice tumbled down the hole." Another example, "The books tumbled off the table." 8. Brass. Brass means a yellow metal made from copper and zinc. For example, "There was a brass plate on the door." Another example, "The lamp had a shiny brass handle." 9. Curtsy. Curtsy means a polite bow made by bending the knees, usually by girls or women. For example, "Alice made a curtsy to the Queen." Another example, "She curtsied before leaving the hall." 10. Queer. Queer means strange or odd, old-fashioned use. For example, "That was a very queer thing to say." Another example, "Alice felt queer after drinking the potion." 11. Tidy. Tidy means neat and in order. For example, "The white rabbit wanted his house tidy." Another example, "Please keep your desk tidy and clean." 12. Dreadfully. Dreadfully means very badly or extremely. For example, "Alice was dreadfully confused." Another example, "It was dreadfully cold that night." 13. Cheshire. Cheshire means something or someone from Cheshire, a region in England. For example, "The Cheshire cat smiled mysteriously." Another example, "She had a grin like the Cheshire cat." 14. Pattering. Pattering means light, quick tapping or running sounds. For example, "She heard the pattering of little feet." Another example, "Rain was pattering softly on the leaves." 15. Shrill. Shrill means high-pitched and loud in sound. For example, "A shrill voice cried, 'Off with her head.'" Another example, the whistle made a shrill sound. 16. Splendid. Splendid means wonderful, excellent, or grand. For example, what a splendid garden this is. Another example, the Queen wore a splendid red dress. 17. Eagerly. Eagerly means with excitement or strong interest. For example, Alice eagerly opened the small door. Another example, they waited eagerly for the results. 18. Croquet. Croquet means a game played with balls, mallets, and hoops on grass. For example, they played croquet with flamingos as mallets. Another example, croquet was popular among the royal family. 19. Mock. Mock means to make a fun of someone or something. For example, the mock turtle looked very sad. Another example, it's not kind to mock your friends. 20. Quadrille. Quadrille means an old dance for 4 couples. For example, the lobster quadrille was about to begin. Another example, they danced the quadrille at the royal ball. 21. Fury. Fury means great anger or wild rage. For example, the mouse spoke with great fury. Another example, he shouted in fury when he lost. 22. Trial. Trial means a formal court process to decide guilt or innocence. For example, the knave was on trial for stealing tarts. Another example, the trial lasted all morning. 23. Verdict. Verdict means the decision made by a jury in a trial. For example, the jury gave a guilty verdict. Another example, the verdict was announced loudly. 24. Accuse. Accuse means to say that someone has done something wrong. For example, the Queen accused the knave of theft. Another example, he was accused of breaking the rules. 25. Evidence. Evidence means facts or information that prove something is true. For example, the letter was used as evidence in the trial. Another example, there was no clear evidence of the crime. 26. Bewildered. Bewildered means very confused or puzzled. For example, Alice looked bewildered when the cat disappeared. Another example, he felt bewildered by the strange directions. 27. Venture. Venture means to go somewhere or do something risky or new. For example, Alice ventured into the dark forest. Another example, few people would venture into that cave. 28. Procession. Procession means a line of people or things moving together. For example, a grand procession entered the court. Another example, the procession moved slowly through the garden. 29. Melancholy. Melancholy means a deep, gentle sadness. For example, the mock turtle sang with a melancholy voice. Another example, there was a melancholy look in her eyes. 30. Wretched. Wretched means very unhappy, miserable, or poor in quality. For example, what a wretched day this has been. Another example, the wretched creature begged for help. 31. Solemnly. Solemnly means seriously or without any joke. For example, the king spoke solemnly to the crowd. Another example, she nodded solemnly in agreement.
32. Hedge. Hedge means a row of bushes forming a fence. For example, the cards painted the white roses on the hedge red. Another example, a rabbit ran quickly behind the hedge. 33. Haste. Haste means great speed or hurry. For example, in her haste, Alice forgot the key. Another example, don't act in haste, think carefully. 34. Nibble. Nibble means to eat something in small bites. For example, Alice nibbled the cake to see what would happen. Another example, the mouse nibbled at the cheese. 35. Vanish. Vanish means to disappear suddenly. For example, the Cheshire Cat began to vanish slowly. Another example, the mist vanished when the sun came out. 36. Grin. Grin means a wide smile. For example, only the Cheshire Cat's grin remained. Another example, he gave her a big grin before leaving. 37. Sneeze. Sneeze means to blow air suddenly from your nose and mouth. For example, the baby began to sneeze loudly. Another example, Pepper made the cook sneeze again and again. Pepper. Pepper means a spicy powder used in cooking. For example, the soup had too much pepper in it. Another example, she sneezed because of the pepper in the air. Mushroom. Mushroom means a kind of soft fungus that grows in the ground. For example, Alice saw a large mushroom under the tree. Another example, the caterpillar sat on the mushroom smoking a pipe. Caterpillar. Caterpillar means a small, long insect that turns into a butterfly. For example, the blue caterpillar spoke in a slow voice. Another example, the caterpillar climbed up the leaf slowly.
41. Potion. Potion means a magical liquid with special effects. For example, the drink me potion made Alice small. Another example, he drank a potion that gave him courage. 42. Label. Label means a piece of paper with information on it. For example, the bottle had a label that said, "Drink me." Another example, always read the label before using medicine. 43. Saucer. Saucer means a small plate for a cup. For example, the teacup sat on a tiny saucer. Another example, she placed the spoon on the saucer. 44. Teapot. Teapot means a container used for making and serving tea. For example, the hatter poured tea from the teapot. Another example, a silver teapot stood in the middle of the table. 45. Mad. Mad means crazy or very strange, British English. For example, everyone here is mad, thought Alice. Another example, the Mad Hatter laughed loudly. 46. Hatter. Hatter means a person who makes or sells hats. For example, the Mad Hatter had a big hat on his head. Another example, the Hatter worked in a small shop in town. 47. Dormouse. Dormouse means a small animal that sleeps a lot, similar to a mouse. For example, the dormouse was sleeping at the tea table. Another example, they tried not to wake the dormouse. 48. March hare.
March hare means a wild rabbit, especially one acting excited or crazy in spring. For example, the March hare offered Alice some tea. Another example, he jumped around like a March hare. 49. Trumpet. Trumpet means a brass musical instrument that makes a loud sound. For example, a white rabbit blew a trumpet at the trial. Another example, the trumpet announced the arrival of the Queen. 50. Knave. Knave means an old word for a servant or a dishonest man. For example, the Knave of Hearts was accused of stealing tarts. Another example, the knave bowed before the Queen. 51. Tart. Tart means a small pie with sweet filling, usually fruit or jam. For example, the Queen loved strawberry tarts. Another example, the knave was accused of stealing the tarts. 52. Summon. Summon means to call someone to come, especially officially. For example, the Queen summoned Alice to the court. Another example, he was summoned to meet the king. 53. Tremble. Tremble means to shake slightly from fear or cold. For example, Alice began to tremble before the Queen. Another example, the little mouse trembled with fright. 54. Flourish. Flourish means to wave something proudly or showily. For example, the rabbit entered with a great flourish. Another example, he flourished his hat before sitting down. 55. Offend. Offend means to make someone upset or angry. For example, Alice didn't mean to offend the Queen. Another example, be careful not to offend your friends.
56. Nonsense. Nonsense means words or ideas that make no sense. For example, sentence first, verdict after, said the Queen. Nonsense, cried Alice. Another example, that story is complete nonsense. 57. Patience. Patience means the ability to wait calmly. For example, Alice tried to keep her patience during the tea party. Another example, learning English takes a lot of patience. 58. Timidly. Timidly means shyly or without confidence. For example, the mouse spoke timidly to Alice. Another example, she raised her hand timidly in class. 59. Ferret. Ferret means a small animal like a weasel used for hunting rabbits. For example, the king mentioned a ferret in his story. Another example, a ferret ran quickly through the grass. 60. Flustered. Flustered means nervous or confused, especially when rushed. For example, the rabbit looked flustered and dropped his gloves. Another example, she became flustered when everyone stared at her. 61. Utterly. Utterly means completely or totally. For example, Alice was utterly confused by the Queen's orders. Another example, it was utterly impossible to understand the Hatter. 62. Confess. Confess means to admit that you did something wrong. For example, the knave refused to confess to stealing the tarts. Another example, he finally confessed the truth. 63. Spectacles. Spectacles means old-fashioned word for eyeglasses. For example, the rabbit put on his spectacles to read the paper. Another example, grandfather always wore his spectacles to read. 64. Porcelain.
Porcelain means a type of fine, white ceramic material. For example, the teacups were made of porcelain. Another example, she admired the porcelain dolls on the shelf. 65. Inkstand. Inkstand means a container that holds ink for writing. For example, there was an inkstand on the desk in the court. Another example, he dipped his pen into the inkstand. 66. Trial. Trial means a legal meeting to decide if someone is guilty. For example, the trial of the knave began with much noise. Another example, everyone waited for the trial to end. 67. Sentence. Sentence means the punishment decided after a trial. For example, the Queen shouted, "Sentence first." Another example, he received a short sentence for his mistake. 68. Verge. Verge means the edge or border of something. For example, Alice stood on the verge of tears. Another example, the rabbit was on the verge of running away. 69. Dismay. Dismay means a feeling of sadness and disappointment. For example, to her dismay, the door was locked again. Another example, he looked at the broken cup in dismay. 70. Unfold. Unfold means to open or spread something that was folded. For example, Alice unfolded the paper carefully. Another example, the story began to unfold before her eyes.
71. Scornful. Scornful means showing disrespect or mockery. For example, the Queen gave a scornful laugh. Another example, he looked scornful when she made a mistake. 72. Shriek. Shriek means to scream loudly and sharply. For example, the Queen shrieked, "Off with her head." Another example, she shrieked when she saw the spider. 73. Clutch. Clutch means to hold something tightly. For example, Alice clutched the key in her hand. Another example, the bird clutched the branch with its claws. 74. Cease. Cease means to stop doing something. For example, the shouting did not cease until the Queen left. Another example, the rain ceased and the sun came out. The cat crept silently across the floor. 79. Glare. Glare means to look at someone angrily or with strong eyes. For example, the Queen glared at the white about the strange bottle. Another example, she inquired where the path would lead. 81. Plead. Plead means to ask for something seriously or beg. For example, disapproved of nonsense talk. Another example, her father disapproved of her decision. 83. Astonish. Astonish means to surprise greatly, lightly like wings. For example, a bird fluttered past Alice's head. Another example, her heart fluttered with excitement. 85. Stumble. Stumble means to trip or almost fall while 86. Peer. Peer means to look closely or carefully at something. For example, Alice peered down the rabbit hole. Another example, he peered through the fog to see the road. 87. Grumble. Grumble means to complain in a low voice. For example, the cook grumbled about the noisy guests. Another example, she grumbled because she had to clean again. 88. Faint. Faint means to lose consciousness for a short time. For example, Alice felt faint after growing so tall. Another example, he nearly fainted from the heat. 89. Gasp. Gasp means to breathe in suddenly, usually in surprise or fear. For example, Alice gasped when she saw the cat vanish. Another example, they gasped at the size of the Queen's crown. 90. Crawl. Crawl means to move on hands and knees slowly. For example, Alice crawled through the small door. Another example, the baby crawled across the floor. 91. Perch. Perch means to sit or rest on something high or narrow. For example, the bird perched on the teapot handle. Another example, the cat perched on a tree branch above. 92. Tug. Tug means to pull something hard or quickly. For example, Alice tugged at the tablecloth to reach the key. Another example, he tugged the rope to open the gate. 93. Cling. Cling means to hold tightly to something or someone. For example, Alice clung to the tree trunk for balance. Another example, the child clung to his mother's hand. 94. Frown. Frown means to make a serious or unhappy face. For example, the Queen frowned at the late rabbit. Another example, he frowned when he couldn't find his book. 95. Scatter. Scatter means to move or throw things in different directions. For example, the cards scattered across the garden. Another example, the wind scattered the papers everywhere. 96. Sigh. Sigh means to let out a long breath to show sadness or relief. For example, Alice sighed when she finally sat down. Another example, he sighed with relief after the trial ended. 97. Hollow. Hollow means empty inside or having a hole. For example, Alice hid the key in a hollow tree. Another example, the drum made a hollow sound. 98. Dread. Dread means to fear something that might happen. For example, Alice dreaded meeting the Queen again. Another example, he dreaded the idea of speaking in public. 99. Quarrel. Quarrel means to argue or fight with words. For example, the hatter and the hare began to quarrel again. Another example, the sisters often quarrel about small things. 100. Awkward. Awkward means uncomfortable or difficult to handle. For example, it was an awkward moment at the tea party. Another example, she felt awkward when no one answered her question. That's all for today's tricky words from Alice in Wonderland. If you found this helpful and want to learn more challenging words from other stories, make sure to subscribe and turn on the notifications. Dive into the world of English with fun and exciting stories and let your vocabulary grow day by day. See you in the next adventure.